Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're jumping right into a huge puzzle at the very core of strategy. What's the difference between a threat that's real and one that's just talk? That question sounds pretty simple, right? But the answer, well, it kicked off a total revolution in how we think about strategy. It touches literally everything from billion-dollar corporate takeovers to international politics. It's all about learning to see the difference between a real binding commitment and just an empty, hollow threat. And to really get what happened in this revolution, we have to start at the beginning. We need to talk about the foundational idea that set the whole stage, an idea that came from the incredible mind of John F. Nash. What Nash gave us was this amazingly elegant mathematical way to find points of stability in any strategic interaction. A Nash equilibrium is like a point of balance. It's where every single player is making the absolute best move they can, given what all the other players are doing. At that point, nobody wants to be the one to change their strategy. And this idea was an absolute game changer. It just exploded. Suddenly, it was the go-to tool for analyzing strategy everywhere. I mean, if you were modeling how companies compete or how nations negotiate trade deals, the Nash equilibrium was the bedrock you built everything on. But there was a problem. A pretty big one, actually. Sometimes, the beautiful math of the Nash equilibrium pointed to outcomes that, when you looked at them in the real world, just didn't seem plausible. Something felt off. Okay, so let's make this concrete. We're going to walk through a classic scenario, a showdown between a big company that controls a whole market, a monopolist, and a potential new rival who's thinking about jumping in. So it's a two-step game. It happens in sequence. First, the new competitor makes its move. Do I enter or do I stay out? Then, if they do decide to enter, the monopolist has to react. Do I start an all-out price war or do I just kind of make room for them? Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Using Nash's original concept, this little game actually has two stable outcomes, two equilibria. In one, the competitor gets scared off by the monopolist's threat of a price war, so they just stay out. In the other, the competitor enters, and the monopolist just accommodates them. Technically, the math says both are stable. But are they both equally believable? That first outcome is so fascinating because the whole thing is held up by a threat that never even gets tested. The competitor chickens out, the monopolist keeps its monopoly, and that big, scary price war, it never even happened. And this gets right to the heart of the problem. You have to ask the critical question. If the competitor actually called the monopolist's bluff and entered the market, would the monopolist really choose to start a super costly price war that would hurt them both? Probably not, right? A threat is really easy to make when you don't think you'll ever have to follow through on it. And this is exactly where the German economist Reinhard Selten comes into the story. He saw this exact problem, this loophole, and he brought a powerful new requirement to the table for analyzing strategy, the idea of credibility. Selten's insight here was just brilliant. He basically said, look, it's not good enough for a strategy to be rational only at the start of the game. It has to be the rational choice at every single possible decision point along the way. He called this a subgame perfect equilibrium. Your whole plan has to hold up, even in the parts of the game you were hoping to avoid. And the way you test for this is genius. You work backward from the end. So let's jump ahead to that final decision, the subgame. The competitor is already in the market. Now, what's the rational move for the monopolist? Start a destructive price war that tanks their own profits? No way. The smart play is to accommodate. And since any smart competitor can see that from a mile away, what's their best move at the very start? To enter. They know that threat is just hot air. And this is a perfect illustration of what Selten's concept does. It acts like a pair of logical shears. You just snip off the branches of the decision tree that are held up by these non-credible, empty threats. And what you're left with is the only outcome that's built on rational choices at every single step. This was such a profound step up from Nash's original work. Selten introduced this idea of dynamic logic, or what we call sequential rationality, into game theory. Now, strategies didn't just have to be stable. They had to be believable at every single stage of the game. So, okay, that's the theory, but how did this new filter for credibility actually change things in the real world? Well, the impact was enormous. It transformed how we understand everything from business strategy to public policy. Yeah, Selten's work was way more than just some academic tweak. It gave economists a powerful new lens to really analyze credibility, and this had massive ripple effects. For example, in what we call institutional credibility, you could now rigorously model whether a central bank's promise to fight inflation was actually believable. Or take mechanism design, which is all about creating rules for things like auctions. Selten's idea became a core requirement. It forced us to think about how to build systems where commitments are believable by design. And in 1994, for this pioneering work, for teaching us how to sort credible threats from empty ones, Reinhard Selten shared the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences, right alongside John Nash and John Harsanyi. By forcing us to prune away all those empty threats, Selten's work gives us a much clearer picture of the strategic world. It teaches all of us to look past the bluster, to look past the talk, and to analyze the real incentives at every step. And that leaves us with a critical question, not just for economists, but for all of us. When you make a commitment, what are you doing to make it truly credible?